Montana Territory, September 1878, the town of Blackwood. She stood on a wooden platform in the middle of the street, being sold off like livestock by her own uncle. $15, a man shouted from the crowd. Then came the sound of heavy boots cutting through the dust, 3 big men, eyes cold as steel, walking straight toward the auction block. $50 in goods, the man in front said flat and certain, and a Winchester rifle. She lifted her chin and looked him dead in the eye, with no idea that being bought wasn't the end of her story. It was the beginning of a life she never dared to dream of. This is the blood bargain. Follow Adelaide into the wild mountains, where her fate is about to take a turn no one saw coming. Don't look away, stay till the end. The sun hit Blackwood, Montana, like a punishment. It was the kind of September heat that had no mercy in it, the kind that baked horse manure into the street and made the stench rise up and cling to your clothes. Dust hung in the air like smoke that forgot to move. Gold-colored and lazy, it drifted over the rooftops, over the hitching posts, over the men leaning against the general store with their thumbs in their belts, and nothing better to do than watch other people suffering. Adelaide Thorne was giving them plenty to watch. Her uncle's grip on her wrist was iron. Ephraim Thorne was not a big man, but he had the strength of desperation in him, and desperation is uglier than size. He hauled her up the 3 steps of the wooden loading platform outside Haggerty's general store, and she stumbled on the top step and nearly went down on one knee before he yanked her upright by the arm. "Stand straight," he said, low and mean. "You want these men to think you're broken?" She was 22 years old. She felt about 100. Addie stood where he put her. She kept her chin level. She had learned a long time ago that looking down invited more cruelty, not less. She fixed her gaze on a point somewhere above the heads of the men who had begun to gather in the street below the platform, and she breathed through her nose, and she did not let herself think about what was happening. Ephraim had dressed her up for this. Clean dress, hair pinned back, boots without too much mud on them. He'd done it the way you might wash a horse before you sold it. "Gentlemen," Ephraim called out, loud and oily, spreading his arms like a circus performer. "I got a situation here that requires a practical solution. My niece, Miss Adelaide Thorne, 22 years of age, sound of body, and sharp enough of mind for household work. I am a man of significant debt, and I ain't got time to be running a charity house." Someone in the crowd laughed. Another man spit tobacco into the dust. Addie kept her eyes fixed on that nothing point above their heads and breathed. The men came closer, 6 of them, 8, more drifting in from the saloon across the street, from the assay office, from the livery. Miners mostly, some of them with the blank, hollow eyes of men who had been in the mountains too long and forgotten that women were people. One of them, a heavy-set man with a red beard, climbed right up onto the platform and walked a slow circle around her, looking her over. She did not move. She did not react. She was somewhere else in her head, a place she had built over the years where none of this could reach her. "Turn around," Redbeard said. "She'll turn when the price is settled," Ephraim said sharply, and that was when Sheriff Corbin showed up. Corbin was the law in Blackwood, which meant he was the law in name only. He was a tall man, thin in the way of men who are mean instead of lean, with a silver badge pinned to a vest that had never seen honest work. He climbed the platform steps without being invited and planted himself next to Ephraim like they had rehearsed this. "I'll take a 20% facilitation fee," Corbin said quietly. "On account of this transaction occurring in my jurisdiction." 15, Ephraim said. 20, Corbin said, and he put one hand on the grip of his pistol. Just rested it there, casual as anything. Ephraim smiled the smile of a man who hated everyone, including himself. 20 it is, Sheriff." Addie heard all of this. She absorbed it. She filed it somewhere very deep and kept breathing. The bidding started badly and got worse. The men in the crowd weren't rich. They were miners and drifters and men between paychecks, and the amounts they called out were insulting, even for livestock. $15. 20. One man offered a mule and a jug of whiskey, and Ephraim told him where to go with some colorful language that made the crowd laugh again. Addie thought, this is what I am worth to them. Less than a mule, she thought. I will not cry, not here, not for these people, she thought. I hope it is someone old. Old men are tired. Tired men don't ask much. And then she heard boots, not the shuffling, dusty boots of miners. These were deliberate, slow, and even on the packed dirt street, the kind of footfall that made people step aside without being asked. She let her eyes drop from that nothing point, and she looked toward the sound, and she saw three men coming up the center of the street. They were large, all three of them. Not fat, not puffed up, just built solid the way men get when they work a mountain instead of work a desk. They wore trail-worn clothes, and their faces were bearded and weathered, and their eyes moved constantly, checking the street, the rooftops, the crowd, the platform, cataloging threats the way men do, when they have learned the hard way that threats come from everywhere. The eldest one was in front. He looked about 30, 32 maybe, dark beard going to iron gray at the jaw, eyes pale and sharp as a hawk's. He walked like a man who had been shot at before, and found it irritating. The one to his left was younger by a few years, quieter in his posture somehow, even while walking. He had a tracker's stillness in him, a way of moving through space without disturbing it. His eyes swept the crowd once slowly, and then settled on the platform. On her, she looked away. The youngest one on the right had a notebook tucked into his jacket pocket and ink stains on his right hand. He was scanning the scene with an expression that wasn't anger exactly. It was more like assessment, like he was already calculating something. Ephraim spotted them and changed his posture. Even from the platform, Addie could see the hesitation move through her uncle's body. Callahan, Ephraim said. Not quite a greeting, more like an acknowledgement. The eldest one, Gideon Callahan, stopped at the foot of the platform steps. He did not climb them. He stood in the street and looked up at Ephraim, and he took his time about it. What's the number? Gideon said. It wasn't quite a question. Bidding still open, Corbin said from the platform. He had recognized the brothers and squared his shoulders up. You want to make an offer. You wait your turn like everyone else. Gideon looked at Corbin, just looked at him. Corbin stopped talking. What's the number? Gideon said. Again to Ephraim this time. Ephraim licked his lips. Highest bid so far is $32. Cash or equivalent goods. Gideon reached into the front pocket of his coat and produced a folded piece of paper. He held it up. $50 in goods. Flour, salt pork, dried corn, seed stock. Already loaded on the wagon behind us. He let the paper drop to the top step of the platform, and a Winchester Model 1873 with 2 boxes of ammunition. The crowd went quiet. $50 in frontier goods, and a repeating rifle. That was real money. That was winter survival money in a mining town, and everyone standing in that street knew it. Ephraim looked at Corbin. Corbin looked at Ephraim. Some silent negotiation passed between them, some greedy calculation about whether they could push further, whether the Callahan brothers were worth antagonizing. Gideon Callahan stood in the street and waited. He did not look impatient. He did not look nervous. He looked like a man who had already decided how this was going to end and was simply giving the other parties time to catch up. Done, Ephraim said. Corbin smiled slow. Plus, my facilitation is covered in the goods, Gideon said. Ephraim can negotiate your cut out of his share. He looked at Corbin steadily. We're done here, Sheriff. Corbin's jaw tightened, but he stepped back. The youngest brother, Thad, came up the platform steps and collected the goods receipt and handed Ephraim a signed transfer of supply. He did it methodically, like a man completing a legal transaction rather than purchasing a human being. She would think about that later. That deliberate care in how he handled the paperwork. She would think about it and not quite understand what it meant yet. The middle brother, Jasper, came up the steps and stopped a careful distance from her. He did not reach for her. He stood where she could see him clearly, gave her a moment to look at him, and then he gestured toward the street. "Wagons behind the feed store," he said quietly. "I'll carry anything you want to bring." Huh? She had one bag. She picked it up herself. The crowd parted as they walked her off the platform and through the street. Addie kept her spine straight and her chin level, and she did not look back at her uncle, standing on that loading dock, counting the supply receipt like it was gold. She did not let herself feel anything yet. She climbed into the wagon bed herself, without help, and sat with her bag pressed to her chest, and she watched Blackwood fall away behind her. As the wagon rolled north toward the mountains, she was certain of exactly one thing. She had been bought, and bought women did not have good lives ahead of them. She pressed her lips together, and she breathed, and she watched the tree line swallow the road, and she waited to find out what kind of man Gideon Callahan actually was. The road into the mountains took 3 hours and said almost nothing. Addie sat in the wagon bed with her bag in her lap and watched the terrain change. Blackwood fell away behind them fast. The stink of it, the noise of it, and then there was just forest. Ponderosa pine climbing the canyon walls on both sides, the trunks going up straight and enormous. The canopy so thick in places that the light came through in shafts instead of sheets. The air changed too. Cooler, cleaner, carrying the smell of resin and cold creek water and something else she couldn't name. Something that wasn't a smell exactly, but a quality. Like the mountain had less tolerance for nonsense than the town did. Gideon drove the team up front. He didn't speak. Jasper rode alongside on a dark roan horse, drifting in and out of the tree line at the edges of the trail, appearing and disappearing without sound. Thad sat up in the wagon bench a few feet from his brother and occasionally wrote something in his notebook. None of them spoke to her. None of them looked back at her, either, not in the way the men in Blackwood had looked at her. They simply rode and drove and let the miles happen. She studied them without meaning to. She was a woman who had learned to read men fast, because reading them wrong had consequences. Gideon's shoulders were broad and set square, never tense, never slack. He handled the team with short, confident adjustments of the reins, not showing off, just competent. The quiet kind that doesn't need an audience. Thad closed his notebook at some point and stared at the trail ahead, and she could see his lips moving slightly, like he was working through something in his head, a calculation or a sentence. She wasn't sure. Jasper emerged from the tree line on the left, fell in beside the wagon for a minute, made eye contact with Gideon, and shook his head once. Gideon nodded. Some information had passed between them that she didn't have the vocabulary for yet. She kept her hands flat on her bag and her breathing even. They climbed higher. The trail narrowed, then widened again, then crossed a shallow creek twice before the trees opened up, and she saw the cabin. She had expected something rough. A trapper's shack, maybe, or a soldier's dugout. Something that matched her understanding of what men bought women for, which was labor and access and not much else. The cabin was not that. It was massive. Hand-hewn ponderosa logs stacked with precision, the chinking between them clean and tight. A covered porch running the full front length, deep enough to work under in rain. 2 stone chimneys, one at each end, both showing smoke. A proper door with iron hardware. Split rail fencing around a garden plot. A livestock pen with actual shelter in it. A woodshed stacked high and neat. A separate structure for tools. Someone had spent years on this place. Someone had intended it to last. Thad jumped down from the wagon bench and held out a hand to help her down. She hesitated for half a second and then took it, because refusing felt like making a point that cost her more energy than she had right now. His grip was dry and brief. He let go the moment her feet touched ground. Gideon unhitched the team and led them toward the livestock pen without ceremony. Jasper had already disappeared somewhere. "Come inside," Thad said. "There's food." She followed him up the porch steps and through the front door and stopped just inside. The cabin was one large main room with a loft above it. The hearth on the far wall was enormous, big enough to roast something substantial, and it was burning steady and even. There was a work table along the left wall, a set of shelves with books on them, actual books, a dozen at least. There were hooks for coats and guns near the door, all of them occupied. There were 2 windows with actual glass in them, not oilcloth, glass, letting in the late afternoon light, and there was a table in the center of the room. Solid pine, hand-built, clearly made by someone who cared about the joints. 4 chairs around it. She counted them twice. 4 chairs. 1, 2, 3, 4. There were 3 brothers. Thad watched her count. He said, "Gideon told me we'd be bringing someone back. I built the chair last week, didn't know who it was going to be." She looked at the chair closest to her. The wood was a different color than the others, lighter, and when she leaned close, she could smell it. Raw timber. Freshly cut and sanded, barely dried. He had built this before they went to Blackwood, before they even knew her name. She pulled her hand back from the chair and stood very still. Thad set a plate on the table. Beans, cornbread, sliced salt pork that had been fried until the edges crisped. He poured water from a clay pitcher into a cup and set the cup beside the plate and pulled the new chair out from the table. "Sit," he said. "Eat first." She sat. She ate. She was hungrier than she had realized, and the food was plain, but it was hot, and there was enough of it, which already made it better than most of what she'd had in the past 2 years. Gideon came inside while she was eating. He washed his hands at the basin near the door, dried them on a cloth, and helped himself to a plate without commentary. Jasper came in a few minutes after, moving quietly through the door and hanging his rifle on its hook before he served himself and sat down. They ate together without much talking. Gideon asked Thad something about the north fence line. Jasper said 3 words about a tree that had come down across the creek trail. Nobody performed anything for her benefit. Nobody explained themselves or made speeches or tried to reassure her. It was the most ordinary meal she had sat down to in years. That ordinariness was so foreign it made her throat tighten. When she finished, she set her fork down carefully and said, "What do you need me to do?" Gideon looked up from his plate. "Tonight," she clarified. "What do you need tonight?" He held her gaze for a moment. His eyes were pale, gray-blue, and they were direct without being aggressive. "Nothing," he said. "Tomorrow, then. I want to know what's expected. Tomorrow we'll talk about the garden and the stores." He picked up his cup. "Tonight, you sleep." "Where?" she said flatly. He stood from the table, and she tensed instinctively, her muscles pulling in toward her center. But he just carried his plate to the basin, and then crossed the room toward the back wall. There was a door. There, she hadn't noticed, set into the logs with a simple iron latch. He pushed it open and stepped aside so she could see in without having to step past him to do it. A room. Small, but a real room. A rope bed with a corn husk mattress and 2 wool blankets folded at the foot. A wooden chest, empty for belongings. A window, small on the east wall. A candle on a shelf with a tin of matches beside it. And on the back of the door, on the inside, an iron bar. Heavy, hand-forged, mounted on 2 brackets so it could swing across and lock the door from within. Gideon pointed at it without touching it. His voice was flat, factual, no theater in it. "This door locks only from the inside," he said. "You decide when it opens or closes. No man in this house touches you unless you invite him." She stared at the bar. It was not a new installation. The brackets were dark with age, set deep into the wood. This bar had been here a long time. She looked at Gideon. "That bar," she said slowly. "Was that already there?" "Yes." "Why?" He looked at the bar and then back at her, and something crossed his face that she couldn't fully read. "Our mother built this room," he said. "She put that bar there herself," she said. "A woman ought to have at least 1 door in the world that answers only to her." Addie said nothing. Gideon stepped back from the doorway. "Get some sleep," he said, and his voice had gone back to the flat, practical register he seemed most comfortable in. "We start early." He walked back to the main room. She heard chairs scraping, and the low sound of Thad's voice, and the fire settling in the hearth. She stepped into the room alone. She set her bag on the wooden chest. She sat on the edge of the bed and put her hands in her lap and looked at the iron bar. Then she stood up and swung it across the door brackets. The clunk it made was solid. Final. She tested it with both hands, leaning into it. It didn't move. She sat back down on the bed. For the first time in as long as she could remember, she was behind a door that no one else could open. She pressed her palms against her thighs, and she sat there in the quiet, and she breathed, and the mountain dark settled around the cabin, and outside she could hear wind in the pines, and nothing else. She did not sleep easily, but she slept. The first week established a rhythm, and the rhythm was hard work. Addie had expected that. She had prepared herself for it on the wagon ride up. Whatever else these men were, they ran a working homestead at elevation, which meant the labor was constant, and the margin for sitting idle was zero. She had told herself she would keep up. She had told herself she would not complain and would not ask for accommodations and would make herself, oh, so obviously useful that they would never have cause to regret the $50. What she had not prepared for was the way they would refuse to let her overdo it. The first morning, she was up before dawn. She had the fire going and water heating before Gideon appeared from the loft, and she saw the flicker of surprise on his face before he controlled it. He said, "Good morning," she said. "Good morning." They drank coffee, standing near the hearth because the table felt formal at that hour, and neither of them suggested sitting. He laid out the day in plain language. The livestock needed water and feed. The woodshed needed splitting. They were about 30 cords short of where he wanted to be before first snow. The garden plot on the south side needed to be turned and composted before the ground froze. "I'll take the garden," she said immediately. He looked at her. "You've turned a garden plot before." "I've done everything before," she said, which was true, and also not something she wanted to say more about. He handed her the long-handled spade from the tool shed and showed her where the compost pile was, a steaming heap of kitchen waste and animal manure and pine duff that had been building all summer. The garden plot was roughly 40 feet by 20 feet, already cleared of this season's harvest, the soil compacted and dry from the September heat. She started digging. By midday, her palms were burning. By afternoon, they had gone from burning to a deep, grinding ache that made gripping the handle feel like squeezing broken glass. She kept going. She was not going to stop, and she was not going to say anything about it, and she was not going to give anyone cause to look at her and see a liability instead of a worker. She finished 2/3 of the plot before Gideon called everyone in for supper. At the table, she kept her hands in her lap and tore her bread instead of cutting it, because cutting required grip, and grip was currently a problem. Jasper noticed. She didn't see him notice. She wasn't looking at him, but sometime during the meal, she became aware of him, watching her, hands with the focused, unhurried attention of a man who tracked things for a living, and noticed everything about the way living things moved and held themselves. He didn't say anything that night. The next morning, when she went to the tool shed for the spade, she found it leaning against the wall with a new handle on it, not a replacement handle from a hardware store. A hand-carved one, smooth hardwood, shaped differently from the standard grip. Narrower at the top where the palm rests, flared slightly at the base for control. She wrapped her hand around it without thinking, and it fit, not in the way that a tool fits when it is the right size. It fit in the way a thing fits when it was made for your specific hand, by someone who had paid attention to exactly how you held the one that hurt you. She stood in the tool shed door for a moment and looked at it. Then she put on her work gloves and went back to the plot. That evening, after supper, Gideon asked to see her hands. She didn't want to show him. She compromised with herself and held them out, palms up, expecting criticism of her technique or a suggestion that she let someone else finish the plot. He didn't say either of those things. He went to the shelf near the window and came back with a small tin and opened it. The smell cup first, soft and faintly floral. Calendula, she would learn later. an old remedy. He sat down across from her, and without asking, he took her right hand in both of his and began to apply the salve to her blistered palm with the same focused, deliberate care he seemed to apply to everything. His hands were rough, calloused from years of outdoor work, scarred across the knuckles, strong enough to break things without effort. But his touch was light, more than light, precise, like he was concentrating on doing it right rather than getting it done. She watched his face while he worked. He was not looking at her. He was looking at her hand. His jaw was set in its usual way, unreadable, but there was no impatience in his movements. None at all. "You should have said something yesterday," he said. "I didn't need to," she said. He looked up at her then, briefly. "I'm not looking for someone to break themselves proving a point, Addie." It was the first time any of them had used her name without the formal miss in front of it. She registered that without knowing what to do with it, so she said nothing, and he went back to her hand. She let him finish. Both hands. He closed the tin and put it on the table beside her. "Leave it there," he said. "Use it morning and night until they close." He went back to the fire without ceremony. She sat at the table and turned the tin over in her sore hands, and didn't say thank you because she didn't quite know yet how to accept something without suspecting the cost of it. Thad started the lessons the third evening. It happened without announcement. After supper, while Gideon and Jasper were outside doing the final animal check, Thad cleared his side of the table and set down two things. A primer, small and well used, the cover worn soft, and a piece of paper with letters written in a clear, even hand. He sat down across from her and put the primer between them. "Can you read?" he asked. "Some," she said carefully. "Enough for signs and prices. That's a start." He opened the primer to the first page. "We'll go further than that." She looked at him across the table. He was young, 24 maybe, with the ink-stained hands and the watchful eyes of someone who had learned to trust information more than people. He didn't have his older brother's physical authority, but he had something else, a quality of stillness and confidence that came from knowing things, from having knowledge as a foundation instead of an opinion. "Why?" she said. He looked up from the primer. "Why what? Why bother teaching me?" He was quiet for a moment, not like he was thinking about whether to answer, more like he was choosing which part of the answer mattered most. "Because ignorance is the easiest cage a bad man can lock you in," he said. "When you can read every line of fine print, no man can ever buy or sell you again." She sat with that for a few seconds. It wasn't a sentiment. He wasn't trying to make her feel better. It was a statement of fact delivered in the same register he used for everything else, dry and direct, and completely certain of itself. Like he had thought about this particular truth from multiple angles and was satisfied it held up under examination. She pulled the primer toward her and looked at the first page. They worked for 2 hours that night. Letters first, then sounds, then simple words. She wasn't starting from nothing. She had fragments of literacy, half-learned and cobbled together from a childhood that hadn't prioritized it. Thad had a way of teaching that didn't perform patience, but also never rushed. He corrected her without comment when she was wrong, and moved forward when she was right. At the end of the 2 hours, she could reliably read 14 words she hadn't been sure of that morning. It didn't sound like much, but she thought about it later in her room, behind the iron bar, and she thought about the word he had used, cage. She knew about cages. She had been in several kinds of them, the kind with walls, and the kind with debt, and the kind with other people's opinions of what she was worth. The primer sat on the corner of the table. After that, and every evening, Thad sat down with her. It was not a formality. He took it seriously, and she found herself taking it seriously, too. Practicing during the afternoon, sounding out words on the spice jars and the labels of the tool handles, and the single almanac on the shelf. Within 2 weeks, she was reading full sentences. Within 3, she had started on the slim volume of territorial law that Thad had produced from somewhere in the loft. Arithmetic came alongside it. Thad taught her to count inventory, to calculate board feet of timber, to read a contract's payment terms, and identify where the numbers didn't add up. He showed her how a merchant could make a fair price look unfair and an unfair price look unavoidable, just through the arrangement of numbers on paper. People who can't read contracts, he told her one evening, tapping the relevant paragraph, sign things they never meant to agree to. That's how debt traps work. That's how your uncle's debts became your problem. She looked at the paragraph he was pointing to. A sample contract, something he had written out himself as an example. She read it, slowly, carefully, moving her lips a little. She found the clause, the one buried in the third paragraph, that changed the meaning of everything in the first. She pointed at it. Thad looked at where she was pointing and then at her, a small shift in his expression. Satisfaction, careful and understated. Yes, he said. Exactly that. The nights were cold now. Late September in the Montana high country, the temperature dropped fast once the sun cleared the peaks. The cabin held heat well, the stone hearth radiating long after the fire banked down, and the four of them fell into an evening pattern without discussing it. Supper, then the lesson at the table, then Gideon reading or mending something near the fire. Jasper on the porch regardless of temperature for an hour before bed, doing something with a piece of wood and a knife that was always in a different stage of progress. There was closeness in it, the enforced closeness of a small heated space and a long dark evening and people who had nowhere else to be. She was aware of them in the way you become aware of furniture, that you keep almost bumping into, present and solid, and occupying a fixed amount of space in the world. The smell of the cabin was pine smoke and cured leather, and the particular smell of men who worked outdoors. Not unpleasant, something layered and warm. She noticed Jasper's hands when he whittled. Large hands, calloused the way a tracker's hands get, scarred across the back from briars and wire, and whatever else a decade in the timber throws at you. He worked with absolute concentration and no wasted movement. She noticed Gideon when he read, which was the only time he seemed to fully relax. His shoulders dropped about an inch. The set of his jaw went from iron to something less fixed. She noticed Thad humming very quietly to himself when he thought no one was listening. None of this was dangerous, she told herself. It was simply observation. She was a careful observer. She had learned that too in the years before this mountain. But the mountain evenings were long and warm, and the men across the table and the hearth were not what she had expected them to be, and the primer on the table had her name written in it now, in Thad's clear, even hand, on the inside cover. Property of Adelaide Thorne, not property of anyone else, not to be sold, not to be bartered. Hers. She read those 4 words every evening before the lesson started, and she said nothing about it. And neither did Thad. The blizzard came without warning, the way the worst things always do. October had been mild enough that they'd let themselves believe November might follow suit. The garden was put to bed, the woodshed full, the livestock pen reinforced and banked with straw bales along the north side. Thad had finished winterizing the tool shed. Gideon had salted and smoked the last of the autumn venison. Jasper had packed and marked the trails down to the valley in case they needed to move fast before the passes closed. They were as ready as 4 people could be. Then the sky went the color of an old bruise, and the temperature dropped 20 degrees in 3 hours, and the wind came screaming down the canyon like it had a personal grievance. By nightfall, it was a full whiteout, snow driving sideways past the windows, the glass rattling in its frames. The cabin held. It had held through worse, Gideon said, without elaborating. He banked the fire high, and they ate supper, listening to the storm dismantle the world outside. Addie had learned to read weather in the faces of the brothers. Gideon was watchful, checking the window every hour. Jasper had come in from his evening porch session early, which she had never seen him do. Thad put his books away and kept his boots on at the table, which told her he expected to need them. She kept her own boots on. Around midnight, the livestock started. It wasn't normal noise. She knew the difference by now, 3 weeks in, between the casual sounds of animals settling and the high, panicked sounds of animals that have smelled something wrong. The chickens went first, a sudden shriek of them, and then the mule's bray cut through the storm, harsh and terrified. Gideon was already at the door with his rifle when she came out of her room fully dressed. "Stay inside," he said. She had heard those words her whole life from men who meant them differently than he did. He meant it as protection. She still didn't follow the instruction. She grabbed her coat off the hook and had it halfway on before Jasper put his hand briefly on her shoulder. Not stopping her, just acknowledging her. He handed her the lantern from the table. The three of them went out into the storm. The cold was a physical blow, wind driving snow into every gap in clothing, the lantern guttering and struggling against it. Addie pulled her coat closed with one hand and held the lantern high with the other and followed Gideon's broad back across the yard toward the livestock pen. Her boots punching through snow crust with every step. She heard them before she saw them, not the livestock. The other sound, low and rolling and multiple, coming from the tree line 40 yards to the northwest of the pen. She had never heard wolves up close before. She had heard dogs and coyotes, and they were nothing like this. This was a sound that went straight past your ears and landed somewhere older in you, somewhere that remembered when humans were prey. Gideon stopped walking. The alpha came out of the trees first. Big, easily 130 pounds, coat the gray-black of storm cloud, eyes catching the lantern light and throwing it back green. It stood in the open snow between the tree line and the pen, and it looked at them without moving. More shapes in the trees behind it. 5, 6, maybe more. The pen fence was shaking. The chickens were screaming. The mule had gotten itself into the corner and was kicking at the boards with both back legs, the impact loud even over the wind. Gideon raised his rifle. The alpha took one step toward the pen. Just one. Addie moved left, fast, toward the chicken coop at the near end of the pen. The coop latch was a simple iron hook, and she knew exactly how it worked, because she was the one who opened it every morning. She had to get the chickens secured from the inside of the pen, or the wolves would scatter them across the mountain before morning. She heard Gideon fire, once, a warning shot, high, cracking over the pack. The alpha stopped. The shapes in the trees shifted, nervous, reassessing. She was at the pen gate when Gideon stepped directly in front of her. Not in front of the pen, in front of her specifically. She understood why half a second later when the alpha came in fast from the left, not toward the pen at all, circling wide, and coming at the nearest moving target, which was her. Gideon turned into it without hesitation. He got his left forearm up between the wolf's jaws, and the animal hit him like a thrown boulder, the impact staggering him. Back 2 steps, but not down. He drove his elbow into the side of its head, hard, and the wolf released and skidded in the snow and came up shaking its head. Jasper's rifle cracked from somewhere behind them, one shot, and the alpha yelped and broke left and ran, and the pack broke with it, crashing back into the timber all at once, gone in seconds. The storm filled the silence they left behind. Gideon was breathing hard. He had his right hand pressed to his left forearm, and when Addie raised the lantern, she saw the dark stain spreading through his coat sleeve. "Inside," Jasper said from behind her. He wasn't asking. She secured the chicken coop first. 30 seconds, no more. Gideon didn't argue with her about it, which she noted. Then they crossed back through the yard with the wind tearing at them and got inside and got the door shut. The warmth of the cabin landed on all 3 of them at once, shocking after the cold. Thad was on his feet before they were fully through the door. He took one look at Gideon's arm and went directly for the supply shelf without being asked. Gideon sat down and shrugged his coat off and pushed his sleeve up and looked at the gash, with the detached expression of a man assessing damage to something he owned. It was a real wound, deep 5 or 6 inches long across the outer forearm, bleeding steadily, not arterial but serious. Addie put the lantern on the table and pulled her chair around beside him and held out her hand for the cloth Thad was carrying. Thad looked at her for a half second, then handed it over. She pressed it against the wound with firm, even pressure and held it there. Gideon looked at her, not at his arm. "I told you to stay inside," he said. "I know," she said. "You went to the pen anyway. The chickens needed securing." She kept her eyes on the wound. "You would have done the same." He was quiet for a moment. Then something in his face shifted, not much, but she caught it. "Yeah," he said. "I would have." Thad cleaned and bound the wound with boiled linen while Addie held the edges together. She had helped with livestock injuries before. She knew pressure and placement. Gideon sat through it without moving or making noise, which she suspected was not stoicism, but simply how he processed pain, by not giving it an audience. Jasper had gone back out during the cleaning. She hadn't heard him leave. He came back in when Thad was tying off the bandage, and he closed the door behind him, and he stood in the entrance. For a moment, snow still on his coat, he had something in his hand. A piece of paper, folded once. He turned it over, and she saw the object that had been holding it in place, a knife. A skinning knife, with a dark bone handle and a 7-inch blade, driven point first into the cabin's front door at eye level. The paper had been pinned under it. Jasper brought it to the table without comment and set it down in front of Gideon. Thad came around to read over his brother's shoulder. Addie stayed where she was. Gideon unfolded it with his unbandaged hand. The silence that followed was a different quality than the silence before it. He read it once. Then he read it again. His expression did not change in any dramatic way. It went, if anything, more still. The stillness of a man who has received information he was half expecting, and is now deciding what to do with it. He set the letter on the table and looked at Addie. "It's from Ephraim," he said, "and Corbin." She had not heard her uncle's name spoken in this cabin before. Something cold moved through her that had nothing to do with the storm. Thad read, aloud, flatly, in the voice he used for documents he didn't respect. The letter declared the sale null and void, under territorial law. The stated grounds were that Adelaide Thorne was property under dispute at the time of transaction, pending a debt claim filed by Ephraim Thorne against the estate. The letter demanded $500 in gold bullion as settlement. It gave a deadline of 30 days. And then the last paragraph. Failure to comply would result in Ephraim Thorne and Sheriff Corbin returning with a 10-man posse. The cabin would be burned to the ground. The Callahan brothers would be hanged for harboring an escaped indentured servant. Addie sat very still. The fire in the hearth cracked and settled. Outside, the blizzard howled against the logs. $500 in gold was an impossible number. It was a ransom, not a settlement. It was a number designed to be unpayable, so that Ephraim could claim the outcome he actually wanted, which was not money, but control. She knew how her uncle operated. She had been watching him operate her entire life. The sale was legal, Thad said. He was not saying it to reassure anyone. He was thinking out loud, sorting through the law in real time. Addie is 22. She was not a minor at the time of transaction. An indentured servant designation requires a signed contract between the parties, which doesn't exist. And property under dispute requires a prior claim filed with the territorial court, which Corbin would have had to do before the sale, not after. "He'll forge it," Gideon said. "Probably," Thad agreed. Jasper had not sat down. He was standing at the window, looking out at the storm, at the darkness where the tree line was. His posture had not changed since he'd come back inside, patient and cold, and thinking about something at a distance. Addie looked at the letter on the table. She had been sold and bought, and now she was disputed territory. A line item on a debt ledger. A problem to be resolved with gold or fire. Her uncle had sent wolves once already tonight, in the form of that pack at the tree line. And now here was his name on a piece of paper pinned to the door with a knife. And the message was the same, either way. "You are mine, and I will burn down whatever stands between us. 30 days, she said. "Yes," Gideon said. She nodded once and folded her hands on the table and looked at them. Then we have 30 days to figure it out. The storm pressed against the cabin walls. The fire burned. No one slept much that night. The blizzard sealed the mountain pass on the second day. Jasper checked it at first light, came back in 2 hours with snow to his knees, and a short report. The South Trail was under 4 feet of drifted snow, and the North Canyon route had taken a cornice collapse overnight. They weren't going anywhere. Not toward town, not toward the valley, not toward the territorial court that Thad had been quietly contemplating since reading that letter. 3 days, minimum, possibly 5. The cabin became its own world. It was not an unpleasant world. Exactly. There was food and fire, and enough room to move without bumping into each other every 5 minutes. Gideon's arm was sore but clean. No fever, and he drove himself back to work the second morning, despite Addie's pointed look at the bandage. Thad read and wrote at the table, working on something she could see was a legal document of some kind. Pages covered in his precise small hand. Jasper split firewood in the tool shed, steady rhythmic strokes that she could hear through the walls, and brought loads in every few hours, stacking them near the hearth until the pile grew ridiculous. She continued the lessons with Thad. The blizzard days gave them 3 and 4 hours at a stretch instead of 2, and they pushed deeper into the territorial law volume, into the sections on contracts and debt claims, and the legal definitions of indenture. "Show me what a forged claim would look like," she said on the second afternoon. "Show me how you'd spot it." Thad looked up from his own writing. "Why?" "Because if Corbin files a claim, I want to know what to look for before we're standing in front of someone reading it out loud." He studied her for a moment. Then he turned to a fresh page and started writing an example, narrating as he went. A legitimate claim required a filing date, a territorial seal, a sworn statement from the claimant, and a counterparty signature or a court witness declaration that the counterparty had been formally notified. A forged claim would likely have all of these elements present, but at least one would have the wrong date sequence, earlier claims listed after later actions, or a seal from a jurisdiction that didn't cover the relevant territory. "The date sequence is always where it falls apart," Thad said. "A man who forges documents after the fact has to invent a past. And invented pasts have to be consistent with every other document they can be checked against. Most forgers don't do that work. They write the date they need and hope nobody checks the record against the county ledger." "Can we get to the county ledger?" she said. "When the pass clears, yes," he set his pen down. "That's what I'm working on. A formal affidavit from you, establishing your age, your status as a free woman of majority, and the circumstances of the transaction in Blackwood, dated and sworn before witnesses." "What witnesses?" "We're snowed in." "All 3 of us," he said. "A sworn statement witnessed by 3 unrelated adults is admissible under territorial common law. Gideon and Jasper and I don't share your name. We qualify." She looked at the pages he had been writing. "You've been doing this since the night of the letter." "Yes," he said simply, and picked his pen back up. On the 3rd evening, the wind dropped enough that the cabin no longer felt like it was actively under siege. It still howled in the peaks above them, but at ground level the sound was lower, and the rattling in the window frames stopped. The fire burned easier. The room breathed. Gideon cooked that night, something he rarely did. Thad usually handled supper, but he took over the hearth that evening and made a venison stew that was better than it had any right to be, rich with dried herbs from Addie's garden bundles, and thickened with corn flour, and they sat around the table and ate it with bread and said very little. She was aware of all 3 of them in a different way that evening. The threat in the letter had settled over the past 3 days into something that was not panic, but was not comfortable either. 30 days, 27 now, and the pass still closed, and Corbin somewhere down in the valley, forging documents or paying men to forge them. But there was also this, the table, and the fire, and the stew, and the 4 chairs, and the sound of the wind dropping. She had stopped waiting for the cost of this to show up. She had waited for it every day, for weeks. The invisible bill, the thing that men who did something for you eventually presented when you were too comfortable to see it coming. She had learned about that bill young and paid it in various currencies, and she had been braced for it here from the first night behind the iron bar. It hadn't come. She didn't know what to do with that. After supper, Thad and Gideon stayed at the table. Jasper was on the porch, storm or not, sitting in the dark. She could see the ember of his pipe through the window. She went to her room, and she stood in the middle of it for a moment with her hands at her sides. And she thought about 27 days, and she thought about Thad's affidavit, and Gideon's bandaged arm, and the chair that smelled like fresh timber, and she made a decision. She came back out. Both men looked up from the table. "I'd like to stay out here for a while," she said. "By the fire, if that's all right." "It's your fire, too," Gideon said. She pulled her chair close to the hearth and sat in it and watched the flames. After a few minutes, Thad went back to his writing, and Gideon went back to the book in his lap. And she just sat there in the warmth and the quiet and felt something she hadn't felt in a long time and couldn't fully name. Present, maybe. She felt present. She didn't plan what happened next. It was not a plan. It was a slow, accumulating understanding that came to a head all at once, the way a fire that's been building under damp wood finally catches. She had been moving toward these men for weeks. She understood that clearly now. Not the frantic, desperate movement of someone with no other options, but something more deliberate than that. Something that had grown out of the literacy lessons, and the calendula salve, and the carved shovel handle, and the iron bar that locked only from the inside. She stood up from her chair. Gideon looked up. Thad looked up. Something in her expression made both of them go still. She didn't have words for all of it. She said the simplest version. "I know what I want," she said, "and I want you to know that I know the difference between wanting something and having no other choice." Gideon set his book down slowly. She moved toward the hearth, and she reached back and began to undo the buttons at the back of her dress. The high-necked traveling dress she had arrived in, still the most substantial thing she owned. Her fingers worked down, and then she stopped. She stopped because the firelight was going to reach her back, and her back was the one thing she had never shown anyone. Not willingly, not on purpose, not without the sick certainty of what the person looking at it would feel, which was revulsion, pity, or the particular hunger some people had for other people's damage. Her hands went cold and still. She pulled the dress forward and curled in, and the tears came. Without warning, the way they always did with this, ambushing her from somewhere, she thought she'd locked them down. She pressed her hands against herself, trying to cover what wasn't even visible yet, and what came out of her wasn't speech. It was just sound, just a shaking exhale, and the words that came with it weren't the ones she had planned. "Oh God," she breathed, right there, her hands pressed against the back of her own shoulder, where the scar began, trying to hold it in, trying to keep it covered and contained, and she was weeping without making much noise, but her whole body was shaking with it. No one moved for 1 second, just one. Then Gideon moved. He came around behind her, and he knelt down in the firelight, and he looked at her back, at the scar that ran from her left shoulder blade all the way down and across in a jagged, raised topography of old fire damage, thick and pale and permanent. He looked at it the way he looked at everything, fully, directly, without flinching. And then he lowered his head and pressed his lips to the edge of it, the very top edge, just at the shoulder. Gentle, deliberate, unhurried. She stopped breathing. Jasper had come in from the porch without her hearing. He was there now, beside her, and his hands, his large callous tracker's hands, came up and traced the raised tissue of the scar with a touch so careful and reverent that it reframed the thing entirely. He was not touching damage. His hand said that plainly the way they moved. He was touching terrain. Something that had its own geography, its own history, its own integrity. Thad had moved to the other side, and he held the lantern up, steady and close. He looked at her face first, checking something. Then he spoke quietly, and his voice had none of its usual precision. It had something else. Jasper exhaled, and the word that came out of him was low and full of a wonder that had no performance in it at all. "We found this," he breathed. Not found like a discovery of something lost. Found like recognition. Like something had just been confirmed that he had already suspected, which was that she was not diminished by what had been done to her. The scar was not the proof of her damage. It was the proof that she had burned and survived and kept going, and was here, in this firelit room, on this mountain, still whole. She felt it land differently than anything had ever landed before. Not pity, not hunger, not the discomfort of someone who didn't know where to look. Just that. We found this. Present tense, ongoing. What happened next was not a single moment, but a long one, unhurried and complete. The three brothers and the woman at the hearth, and the fire burning down, and the storm finally quieting outside. They worshipped her. There was no other word for it. Gideon's lips moved along her spine, and his hands were strong and certain, and knew their own restraint. Jasper's touch was the touch of a man who tracked living things and understood that they required patience and care and full attention. Thad, who had given her words when she had none and a framework when she'd had only chaos, spoke to her quietly throughout, telling her what she was, telling her what he saw, the way a man reads a text he has studied and finally understands completely. She let herself be found. She had spent years making herself small and invisible, and taking up as little space as possible because space cost things she couldn't afford to pay. And here were three men who were not asking her to be small, who were in fact physically, practically, actively refusing to let her be small. She cried some more, and she laughed once, surprised by herself, and she said their names, and they answered her every time. The fire burned through its full measure. The storm outside gave up its worst and settled into something quieter. The cabin held, the way it always held, the way it had been built to hold, solid against everything the mountain threw at it. Afterward, she lay in the warmth of the hearth and felt all three of them around her, and she thought about the iron bar on her door. She had not used it tonight. She had chosen to leave the door open. That was the difference. Not the open door itself, but the fact that she had chosen it. Her door, her choice. She thought about her uncle's letter pinned to the wood with a knife, and she thought about 27 days, and she thought about Thad's affidavit on the table, and she let all of it be true at the same time, the threat and the warmth and the fear and the things she was starting. Slowly, and with enormous caution, to think might be love. Gideon's hand rested on her hair, not possessive, just present. She slept before she meant to. Outside, the snow stopped. The clouds broke. Stars came through over the Ironwood Range in their full winter numbers, cold and clear and enormous. And the mountain was very quiet. The hawk was tangled in the garden fence wire. On the morning, the pass cleared. Addie found her on the way to check the chicken coop, a small, sharp-winged shape struggling against the bottom rail. One wing extended wrong. The feathers splayed at an angle that meant something was broken. The bird's eyes were bright and wild with panic, and she had clearly been there through part of the night, exhausted past fighting, but still fighting. Addie crouched down in the snow and stayed very still. The hawk looked at her. Addie looked at the hawk. "All right," Addie said quietly. "I see you." She went back inside and got a cloth from the rag basket, and came back and worked slowly, keeping her movements small and deliberate. The wire had twisted around the bird's left leg, and the left wing had caught in trying to pull free. Addie unwound the wire with careful fingers, talking in a low voice the whole time, not because she thought the bird understood her, but because the sound of a calm voice helped. She had learned that from watching Jasper with the livestock. The hawk screamed once, sharp and furious, when the wire came off the leg. Then she went still, panting. Addie wrapped her in the cloth and carried her inside. Gideon looked up from the table. His eyes went to the bundle in her arms. "Hawk," she said. "Wings injured. Leg 2. She was in the fence wire. He watched her carry the bird to the work table and set her down gently. He didn't tell her to put it back outside. He didn't say anything about not bringing wild animals into the cabin. He just went back to his coffee and watched with the steady attention he gave to things he found interesting. Thad came down from the loft and assessed the situation over her shoulder. Young one, he said, red-tailed. Female, probably. How can you tell? Larger than a male would be at this age. And she survived the night tangled in wire, which suggests a certain temperament. Addie looked at him. Stubborn, Thad said, straight-faced. Determined not to give up. She turned back to the bird and carefully extended the injured wing. Broken, but cleanly. One of the smaller bones near the leading edge, not the main strut. The leg was lacerated from the wire, but not broken. She had seen worse healed. What does she need? Addie said. Splint on the wing. Keep her confined, warm, quiet. Feed her. Thad was already at the shelf, pulling down a tin of linen strips and time, mostly time. Jasper appeared in the doorway from outside, stamping snow off his boots. He looked at the hawk on the work table. He looked at Addie. Something passed across his face that was almost a smile. He went to the corner of the tool shed side of the porch, without being asked, and came back 20 minutes later with a wooden frame, small, open-sided, with thin dowel rods across the front. A simple cage, but well made. Sized exactly right. He set it near the hearth where it would stay warm and went back outside. Addie splinted the wing with Thad's help, working carefully, and put the bird in the cage with a piece of cloth on the floor and a shallow dish of water. The hawk watched her with those furious bright eyes and did not thank her for any of it. Grace, Addie said, looking at her. Thad raised an eyebrow. Her name, Addie said. She's going to need some. She named the bird for the same reason she had accepted the fourth chair and the primer and the calendula salve. Because naming a thing meant you intended to stay long enough to see what it became. The pass opened on the fourth day after the blizzard. Jasper confirmed it at noon. By mid-afternoon, they had a plan. Gideon wanted to move Addie deeper into the timber before Corbin's deadline arrived. He said it plainly at the table that evening, laying out the idea like he laid out everything, without decoration. There was a trapper's cabin 2 ridges north that nobody used in winter. It had a wood stove and a month's worth of stored provisions. She could stay there with Jasper until the legal question resolved. Addie listened to the whole plan, then she said, "No." Gideon looked at her. "No," she said again, clearer this time. She set down the tin cup she was holding and looked at him across the table. "You didn't rescue me just to build me a prettier cage." He was quiet. "I have a voice," she said, "and I will stand on my own feet to claim my justice." The words came out steadier than she expected. She had been thinking about them since the morning she had read Thad's draft affidavit, turning them over while she fed Grace and turned the compost pile and practiced the legal definitions that Thad had been drilling into her for weeks. Oral arguments, burden of proof, the difference between a claim and an established fact. She pushed her chair back and stood up and went to the shelf where Thad kept his papers and came back with the affidavit, 3 pages of it, dense with Thad's precise hand. She set it on the table in front of her. "I've been reading this every day since he wrote it," she said. "I understand every word of it. I know what a territorial seal looks like, and I know what a forged filing date looks like, and I know how to explain the difference to 12 men standing in a field." She looked at Gideon. "Hiding me in a trapper's cabin doesn't fix this. It just delays it. Corbin will come back in the spring with a newer forged warrant, and you'll be having this same conversation with my empty chair at the table." Gideon's jaw worked, not in anger, in the way it worked when he was revising his thinking. Thad was watching her, with an expression she recognized now. The one he got when a student produced an answer he hadn't fully expected. "There's a risk in standing out front," Gideon said finally. "There's a bigger risk in hiding," she said. "Hiding makes it look like there's something to hide. I'm a 22-year-old woman with a legal affidavit, 3 witnesses, and the fact that I was sold, by a man who had no legal authority to sell me and no signed contract to prove indenture. I have the stronger case. I just need the room to make it. Silence. Jasper, who was at the window, turned and looked at her. He said nothing but nodded. Once, with the weight of a man who has made a decision about something. Gideon said, "All right, just that all right." He didn't dress it up. She sat back down and picked up the affidavit and read through the third page again. And Thad moved his chair around the table, and they went through it, line by line. They spent the next 10 days preparing. Thad taught her how to speak to a common law assembly, which was different from reading a document, and different, again, from ordinary conversation. You had to be precise, but not cold. You had to be clear, but not condescending. You had to make the logic visible, lay it out in sequence, give people the thread to pull so they could follow it themselves. "You're not trying to convince them you're right," he told her. "You're trying to show them how to see that you're right. There's a difference." "What's the difference?" she said. "Convincing is something you do to people. Showing is something you do with them." He tapped the affidavit. "Walk them through it. Don't push. Let the facts do the work." She practiced. She practiced while feeding Grace in the morning, running through the argument in a low voice. She practiced in the garden clearing in the afternoon, where she could pace and use her hands. She practiced after supper at the table, with Thad asking her questions in the sharp, skeptical voice of a man who didn't believe her, working her arguments until they didn't shake under pressure. Gideon listened from the other side of the room while she practiced and said nothing, which was the highest compliment he was capable of giving. Grace healed faster than expected. The wing was sound after 2 weeks. The leg closed without infection. By the third week, she was eating on her own and beginning to bait at the cage bars, throwing herself against them and spreading her wings. Furious with confinement, Addie watched her do it. She understood the feeling completely. She changed the dressing on the wing every morning and talked to the bird while she did it. Not about anything in particular, about the weather and the pass, and the way the winter light came through the east window at a different angle every week as the season shifted. Grace ignored the commentary but tolerated the contact, which Addie counted as progress. "She's ready," Jasper said one morning, standing in the doorway looking at the hawk. "I know," Addie said. "Not yet." He looked at her, waiting. "After," she said. "When it's done, we'll take her up to the high meadow and let her go from somewhere she can actually fly." He understood what she meant. She could see it. He nodded and went back outside. She returned to the affidavit. She read it through again for the 40th time. She tested every word against what she knew, against what she'd learned, against what she could prove in the open air, in front of witnesses. She had been bought in a public square in September by men who had no idea what they were actually purchasing. They had been expecting compliance and servitude. And a woman who had been broken down far enough that she would stay broken. They had purchased instead a woman who could now read a legal contract, identify a forged document, and make an argument that would hold up in a frontier assembly. She put the affidavit down and looked at her own hands on the table. The blisters had healed. The skin was thicker now, tougher. Her handwriting had improved to the point where Thad said it was better than some men he'd hired to do bookkeeping. She thought about her uncle's letter, pinned to the door, with a knife. She thought about what he had believed when he wrote it, which was that she had no voice, no legal standing, no knowledge, no options, and no one who would help her claim any of them. He was wrong about all of it. She folded the affidavit carefully and put it in the inside pocket of her coat, where it would stay until she needed it. 23 days since the letter. 7 days left on Corbin's deadline. She was ready. Grace baited against the bars again in the corner, wings spread wide, furious, and perfectly healed. "I know," Addie said soon. The morning Corbin rode in. The sky was the hard, bright blue of deep winter. Not a cloud in it. They had word the day before. A boy from the Fenwick homestead, 3 miles down the south slope, came up the trail on a shaggy pony with a message from his mother. Corbin and a group of men had come through the valley the previous afternoon heading north, asking about the road to Callahan Ridge. He'd had 10 riders with him, the boy said, and he'd had Ephraim Thorne riding at his right hand. Gideon gave the boy a full round of cornbread and a jar of honey and sent him back down the slope and went inside and said, "Tomorrow." They spent that evening on practical things. Gideon checked every rifle in the house and loaded them. Jasper left before dark and came back 2 hours later without saying where he'd been. Thad made a second clean copy of the affidavit and sealed it in oilcloth. Addie reviewed her argument one more time, quietly, to herself, at the table after supper. She didn't need to. She knew it completely. But the rehearsal was not about memory. It was about settling herself into the words so that when the time came, they would come out of her without fear in them. She slept behind the iron bar and woke before dawn and felt clear. They moved to the Ironwood Valley settlement at first light. It was a natural gathering point, half a mile below the cabin, where the mountain families and the homesteaders came together for trading days and assemblies. A wide, flat clearing between the timber and the creek, with room for wagons and horses, and the kind of open sight lines that made ambush difficult. Gideon had sent word to the other families through Jasper's trail network 2 weeks earlier. He hadn't asked for anything specific. He'd simply sent the facts, that a legal dispute was coming, that there would likely be an attempt to enforce a fraudulent warrant, and that witnesses would be useful. He had underestimated the response. By the time they reached the clearing, there were already 30 people there. Homesteaders, midwives, miners from the valley claims, 2 families Addie had never seen before, who turned out to have ridden 15 miles through the night because the Callahan brothers had helped one of their children through a fever the previous winter. 3 men who had worked with Gideon as scouts and were carrying that knowledge in the way they positioned themselves around the clearing's edge, not threatening, just present, an armed circle, quiet, deliberate, patient. Addie stood in the center of it and felt something she had no previous name for, held up, not by any one of them individually, but by all of them collectively, by the simple fact of their presence, which said, this woman has people. Whatever Corbin thought he was riding into, it was not an isolated cabin with 3 men in it. Margaret Fenwick, the woman whose boy had brought the warning, came and stood next to Addie, without being asked. She was a broad-faced woman in her 50s, with flour on her hands and a rifle over her shoulder, and she said, "You let me know if you need anything, honey," in the tone of a woman who had handled harder things than a corrupt sheriff on a Tuesday. Addie said, "Thank you, ma'am." They heard the horses before they saw them. The clearing had that quality of cold winter air, where sound traveled in strange ways, crisp and close. And the hoofbeats came over the ridge and down the slope, and the group of riders came into view. 13 of them, Corbin in front, silver badge catching the winter light. Ephraim at his side on a bay horse, looking thin and yellow in the face, the way gamblers looked at the end of a losing season. 10 men behind them who had the air of hired labor rather than conviction, men doing a job, not men with cause. Corbin pulled up at the edge of the clearing and looked at what was in front of him. He looked at it for a long moment. He had expected a cabin and a road, and maybe 3 armed men. He was looking at 43 people. He was looking at rifles that were not pointing at him, which was almost more unsettling than if they had been. They were just held, the way you hold something when you know you won't need to use it, but want it to be comfortable if you do. Corbin straightened in the saddle and put his official voice on. "I'm here to execute a territorial warrant for the return of Adelaide Thorne, indentured servant, to the custody of her legal guardian, Ephraim Thorne, as represented under territorial law." Nobody spoke. He looked at the faces in the clearing, and none of them looked impressed. "Step aside," Corbin said to the crowd in general. "This is a legal proceeding, and any interference constitutes obstruction of—" "Let me see the warrant." Her voice came out clean. Firm, not loud, she walked forward from the center of the clearing until she was visible, until Corbin could see her clearly, until Ephraim on his bay horse could see her looking back at him without flinching. Ephraim's face did something she had never seen it do. He looked away first. Corbin reached into his coat and produced a folded paper and held it out with the confidence of a man who has never had anyone actually read what they signed. Right here, Miss Thorne. You can see it's all in order. Territorial seal. Filing date. She walked forward and took it out of his hand. She opened it and read it. Took her time. Didn't rush for the audience or for Corbin's increasingly stiff posture. She found it on the second page. Thad had been right. The date sequence. The filing was dated 3 weeks before the Blackwood sale, which would have made it a prior claim, and arguably valid. But the seal was from Gallatin County, which did not have territorial jurisdiction over Blackwood, which fell under Silver Bow County's administration. And the sworn statement referenced Addie's age as 19, which was incorrect and provable. She looked up. This warrant was filed in the wrong county, she said clearly, loud enough for the people in the clearing. She didn't shout. She didn't need to. The cold air carried it. The Blackwood transaction occurred in Silver Bow County. This seal is Gallatin County. Gallatin has no jurisdiction here. She turned to the second page. It also lists my age as 19. I am 22. I was 22 at the time of the Blackwood transaction, which means I was a free woman of majority and not subject to guardianship by anyone, including my uncle. She held up the warrant for the people nearby to see. The filing date is also 3 weeks before the transaction it claims to dispute, which means either Mr. Thorne filed a claim on property he hadn't yet tried to sell, or this date was added to the document after the fact. She folded the warrant and held it against her side. A legal document with an incorrect jurisdiction seal, a falsified age, and a backdated filing date is not a warrant, she said. It is a forgery. Total quiet in the clearing. One of the hired guns behind Corbin exchanged a look with the man next to him. Corbin's face had gone the color of old wood. He said, "Now listen here." "I have a sworn affidavit," Addie said. She reached into her coat and produced it. My name, my age, the date and location of the Blackwood transaction, and the names of 3 witnesses, all adults unrelated to me, who will swear to the facts as documented here. She held it up. I was not an indentured servant. There was no signed contract between myself and my uncle. I was sold in public in Blackwood like livestock, which is itself illegal under territorial law, and any claim he had over me ended the moment I turned 21, a year before the sale occurred. She looked at Ephraim directly now, at the thin yellow face and the eyes that still would not hold hers. You sold something you had no right to sell, and you forged the documents to make it look otherwise, and you are standing in front of 40 people who can all read. Ephraim opened his mouth, closed it. A crack split the air. It was sharp, single, coming from somewhere in the high timber above and to the northeast. Everyone in the clearing heard it. It was not an echo. It was deliberate. Corbin's hand flew to his chest where his badge was pinned. The badge was gone. There was a clean hole through the left side of his vest collar where the badge had been attached. The badge itself was somewhere in the snow 40 feet behind him. He sat on his horse very carefully and did not move. Somewhere in the high timber, Jasper reloaded without hurrying. Margaret Fenwick said, conversationally, to the man next to her, "That boy doesn't miss." Corbin's hired men were not looking at the timber line, and they were not looking at Corbin. They were looking at the 40-odd people around them who had not moved, but were no longer making any pretense of being casual about the rifles they were holding. One of the hired men turned his horse around, then 2 more, then the rest of them, a slow, quiet dissolution, men who had signed on for enforcement work, not for this, not for a public legal argument they had just clearly lost in front of a crowd. They filed back up the slope and over the ridge and did not look back. Ephraim sat on his bay horse with nowhere to go. Corbin looked at the clearing, at the people in it, at the affidavit in Addie's hand, at the hole in his vest where his badge had been. He looked like a man totaling up a column of numbers he didn't like. He looked at Ephraim. Ephraim had no expression left. A man near the back of the crowd, one of the miners Addie didn't recognize, said loudly, "There's a tree in the ironwood, Sheriff. Big ponderosa. Got a long branch." Nobody laughed. That was the thing. Nobody laughed, because it wasn't a joke exactly. Corbin said to Addie, without looking at her, "We'll be leaving now." "Yes," she said. "You will." "This isn't finished," Ephraim said, and his voice had the thin, mean quality of a man who knew he was losing, but couldn't stop his mouth from moving. She looked at him, at the man who had sold her on a loading dock in September like a piece of surplus equipment, at the man whose debts had become her circumstances and whose cruelty had been her childhood, at the man who had sent a letter pinned to a door with a knife because he had been so certain she had no recourse. "It is finished," she said. "You have no legal claim, no valid warrant, no jurisdiction, and no witnesses who haven't just ridden away. You have a forged document and a sheriff without a badge." She held his gaze steadily. "If you come back, I will file with the territorial court in Helena with this affidavit and the witnesses you see standing in this clearing. I will describe the Blackwood transaction in complete detail, and I will make sure every county court within 200 miles has a copy of this forged warrant with your name on it." She let that land. Then she said, "Go." Corbin turned his horse. After a moment, Ephraim turned his. They rode back up the slope and over the ridge and out of sight. The clearing held its breath for 5 seconds. Then Margaret Fenwick let out a long breath and said, "Well done, girl," in the same tone she probably used to compliment her children's arithmetic. The group broke and moved. People came to Addie, shook her hand, said things she heard, but couldn't fully absorb, because she was still standing in the winter sunlight, with the affidavit in her hand, and the sound of her own voice in her head, clean and steady, doing the thing it had done. Gideon appeared from somewhere to her left and stood beside her. He didn't say anything. He just stood there solid and quiet in his weathered coat and looked out at the clearing. After a minute, he said, "Thad's going to want to file a copy of that affidavit with the county court this week while we can still use the trail." "I know," she said. "I was thinking the same thing." He looked at her, the pale hawk eyes direct and unperformative. "You did that," he said. "Thad taught me," she said. "Thad gave you the tools," he said. "You did that." She looked out at the clearing, at the families dispersing to their horses and their wagons, at the mountain rising white and enormous behind them all. She had stood in a public square in Blackwood in September, and she had kept her chin level and looked above the heads of men who were appraising her like livestock. And she had felt like nothing. She did not feel like nothing now. She put the affidavit back in her coat pocket and looked up at the tree line where Jasper would be making his way back down, unhurried, rifle over his shoulder. She had a voice. She had used it, and no one had taken it back. The morning after the standoff was quiet in a way that felt earned. Addie woke before dawn and lay still for a moment, listening to the cabin breathe around her. Wind in the upper pines, the mule shifting in the pen, the fire ticking low in the hearth. She had slept without dreaming, which was new, and she noticed it the way you notice the absence of a sound you have lived with so long you stopped hearing it. She got up and started the fire and put water on and stood at the east window, watching the dark turn gray over the peaks. Gideon came down from the loft, and they drank coffee in the early silence, and he told her that Thad was planning to ride to the Silver Bow County seat within the week to file the affidavit with the court clerk and formally register the forgery complaint against Corbin. "Will it hold?" she said. "It's solid," he said. "Thad doesn't build things that don't hold." She thought about that, about Thad at the table for 3 weeks, writing and rewriting, checking statutes, testing every sentence against the next one, building a legal argument the same way Jasper built a cage for an injured hawk, quietly, without announcing himself, making sure it would do exactly what it needed to do. "What happens to Corbin?" she said, Best case, he loses his badge officially. The one Jasper already took the unofficial version of. Gideon's expression was dry. Worst case, nothing. But he can't come back here with another warrant. Not with witnesses. Not with the filing on record. He'd be compounding a forgery charge with harassment. Even corrupt lawmen have a point past which the risk isn't worth it. And Ephraim. Gideon looked at her over his cup. He's a gambling man with no assets, a fraudulent sale on his record, and nowhere in this territory that will look at him kindly. He's done. She absorbed that. Her uncle had been the weight on her back for so long that she had stopped thinking of him as a finite problem. He had seemed permanent, the way bad weather seems permanent when you are living in it. But bad weather ends. It always ends. She refilled her cup and sat down at the table. Thad came down from the loft an hour later with his notebook already open. He sat across from her, and they went through the affidavit one more time, not because it needed more work, but because he wanted her to understand every legal implication of what she had filed, what the court's response might look like, what the next steps were if Corbin attempted to contest through a different county. He won't, Thad said, but you should know what that looks like anyway. Why, she said. You'll handle the legal filings. I'll handle the filings, he agreed. But you should understand what I'm filing and why, because someday you might be doing this for someone else. She looked at him. He was looking at the document, not at her, pen moving in the margin. There are women in this valley who don't know the law exists to protect them, who sign things they shouldn't sign because no one taught them to read the fine print. He paused. You could teach them. She sat with that for a while. It was not a small idea. She turned it over, examined it from different angles, tested it against herself. A month ago, the idea of standing in a clearing and making a legal argument to 40 armed people would have seemed equally impossible. She thought about Thad's voice at the table 3 weeks ago, flat and certain. Ignorance is the easiest cage a bad man can lock you in. She thought about the 14 words she had learned to read in one evening. She thought about the clause buried in the third paragraph that changes everything. All right, she said, but teach me more first. He looked up Deal. Jasper came in from the morning animal check and poured himself coffee and sat down without interrupting. He had been quieter than usual since the standoff, which was saying something, because Jasper's version of quiet was already profound. He sat with his hands around the cup and looked at nothing in particular. And she had learned by now that this meant he was thinking about something at a distance. She let him think. After a while, he said, without preamble, "There's a letter came in with the Fenwick boy yesterday." She looked up what letter. He reached into his coat pocket and set in an envelope on the table. She picked it up. The return address on it was a woman's name she didn't know and an institution in Denver. She looked at Thad. I sent an inquiry 2 months ago, he said, and there was something careful in his voice, the way there was when he was not sure how a piece of information was going to land. To the Colorado Women's Academic Institute. I wrote about your situation and your progress and what you'd managed to accomplish in a short amount of time. He paused. I asked them if they had scholarship provisions for women of demonstrated aptitude who lacked the financial means. She looked at the envelope. Open it, he said quietly. She did. The letter was 2 pages. She read it slowly, fully, without skipping. Her reading was good now. She could move through formal prose without stumbling, and the letter was formal but clear. The Colorado Women's Academic Institute was offering her a full scholarship, room, board, tuition, a 3-year program in legal studies and civic education, with the option to extend into a 4th year of training as an instructor. The cohort began in April. She read it twice. Then she set it down on the table and sat back and looked at the ceiling of the cabin, at the hand-hewn beams and the lamplight moving across them. Gideon had come in from the porch at some point and was standing near the hearth. She didn't look at him. She looked at the ceiling and she breathed, and she let the full weight of the letter sit in her hands. A scholarship, a program, a different life, formal and structured, and located somewhere else. Denver, which was civilization and institution, and women who had been educated their whole lives in rooms built for that purpose. She thought about what that would have meant in September. In September, standing on a loading dock in Blackwood, with her uncle's hand on her wrist, she would have wept for an offer like that. Would have taken it with both hands, without a moment's hesitation. She thought about that woman, the one on the loading dock, and she felt an enormous tenderness toward her, the way you feel toward a version of yourself that suffered. Before you understood how things could be different. But she was not that woman anymore. She looked around the table, at Thad's ink-stained hands and careful eyes, at Jasper's still posture and the cup held between his large, scarred palms, at Gideon by the hearth, watchful and quiet, at the fourth chair, which had smelled like raw timber the first night she sat in it and smelled now like home, at the primer on the shelf with her name written on the inside cover, at Grace in the corner, sitting still for once, watching the room with her bright, furious eyes. She thought about what Thad had said. Someday you might be doing this for someone else. She folded the letter and put it back in the envelope. I want to respond, she said. Of course, Thad said. I want to thank them properly. The woman who wrote it. She set the envelope on the table, and I want to ask if they have a correspondence program, because I think what I want to do is here, and I think I can learn what I need to learn here with you. She looked at Thad directly, if you're willing to keep teaching. He was quiet for a moment. You're certain? No, she said honestly, but I know the difference between running towards something and running away from something, and I know which one this would be. Gideon moved from the hearth to the table and sat down. He folded his hands on the table and looked at them, then at her. There's something I need to say, he said. She waited. We want you here, all three of us. That's not something I'll pretend otherwise about, he met her, eyes direct as always. But wanting you here and keeping you here are two different things. We protected you so you could belong to yourself, not to keep you for ourselves. She held his gaze. Real freedom means having the right to leave, he said. He reached into his coat and put two things on the table. A stagecoach ticket, Blackwood to Denver, dated for the following week, and a folded paper that turned out to be a tally, careful and exact in Thad's handwriting, of wages for 3 months of household and agricultural work at a fair frontier rate. Her back wages. She looked at the ticket and the money, and then at Gideon, and she understood completely what he was doing. What all three of them had been doing from the first night, with the iron bar on the door, building her a foundation, not a cage, giving her options, not obligations. You're serious, she said. Always, he said. She picked up the ticket. She turned it over in her hands. She looked at the date and the destination and the coach line and all the things it represented. Departure, possibility, a life she had every right to go and build somewhere else. She set it back down on the table. She looked at Thad. I already gave you my answer. He nodded slowly. She looked at Gideon. But I want it understood. I stay because I choose to, not because I have nowhere else to go, not because I'm afraid of the alternative. She looked at Jasper. I stay because my heart, my work, and my home are on this mountain. And that's a reason, not an excuse. Jasper looked at her across the table and said nothing. But something settled in his face, something that had been held very carefully for a long time and was now released. Gideon reached over and picked up the stagecoach ticket and folded it once and tucked it into his breast pocket. I'll keep it, he said, in case you change your mind. You'll be carrying it a long time, she said. She could have sworn the left corner of his mouth moved, barely. Thad slid a fresh sheet of paper across the table to her and put a pen beside it. Draft the response to Denver, he said. You write the first version. I'll review the language. She picked up the pen. She wrote the opening line herself, without help, in her own hand. Confident, level, unhurried. She wrote it the way she had spoken in the clearing, knowing what she meant and meaning it fully. Outside the window, the mountain was white and enormous, and absolutely her own. Spring came to the Ironwood range the way it always did, slowly, and then all at once. March was still cruel, cold nights and frozen mornings, but the light changed. By the second week, there was a quality to the afternoon sun that was different from winter, lower and warmer, staying on the south-facing slopes long enough to melt the upper crust of snow so it refroze at night into something that crunched loudly under boots. The creek under the ice started talking. The mule stood in the pen with his head over the south rail. Every afternoon, eyes closed, facing the sun, Grace had been ready for weeks. She sat in her cage by the hearth and tolerated it less and less. She had been tolerating it for months with the focused, furious patience of something that knew it was temporary. But in March, the tolerance ran out entirely. She baited at the bars constantly, flaring her wings, making the particular sound she made when she was done with whatever was happening. Addie watched her and felt the clock on it. Not yet, she said, one morning in late March, when Grace threw herself against the bars, hard enough to rattle the cage on its shelf. A few more weeks. When the prey is moving, Grace looked at her with profound contempt. I know, Addie said. In those weeks between the standoff and spring, the cabin changed. Not in any way you could point to physically, not in the structure or the furnishings, but in the atmosphere of it. The weight that had been sitting over the four of them since Ephraim's letter came off in stages, the way a fever breaks, not all at once, but in increments. First, the tension around the threat itself, then the coiled readiness that Gideon in particular had been carrying, then the waiting, the vigilance that had all of them listening too hard to every sound outside. Thad filed the affidavit in Silver Bow County in early February. The court clerk had received it, registered it, and issued a formal acknowledgement that the warrant Corbin had presented was under review. 2 weeks later, a letter from the county seat informed them that Sheriff Corbin had been suspended pending investigation of misconduct. Thad read the letter out loud at supper. He read it in his flat, precise way. When he finished, there was a short silence, and then Gideon said, "Good," and went back to eating. That was the whole ceremony. It felt right. Ephraim Thorne did not reappear. Addie was not surprised. He had never been a man who stood his ground when the ground stopped being profitable. He would move on to the next town and the next angle, and she would never see him again, and that was fine. That was more than fine. She continued the lessons with Thad through the winter, pushing further than she had before. Contract law, property rights, the specific provisions of territorial homestead claims, and how a woman could file one in her own name. Thad had a copy of the Homestead Act in his legal volume, and they went through it line by line over the course of 3 evenings. A woman of majority can file a homestead claim in her own name, she said. On the 3rd evening, testing the statement. If she's unmarried or widowed, Thad confirmed. Head of household, she repeated. She thought about that. What counts as a household? A person living on and improving a parcel of land. He looked at her over the book. You've been improving this land since September. The garden expansion you did before the freeze, the composting, the soil work, all of it counts as land improvement under the Act. But this isn't my land. Not yet, he said, and then he went back to the text like he hadn't said anything particularly significant. She filed it away. Spring brought more than thaw. A woman named Ruth McIntosh from the valley came up the trail in April with her oldest daughter, a girl of 15, and a question she seemed embarrassed to be asking, which was whether it was true that someone up on Callahan Ridge was teaching reading to women who wanted to learn. Addie sat her down at the table and gave her coffee and said, "Yes, me. When do you want to start?" Ruth McIntosh's embarrassment lasted about 3 minutes. After that, she was all business, pulling a list of questions from her coat pocket that she had clearly been working up for some time. Her daughter had a quick mind and latched onto letters, like she had been waiting for them. They stayed 4 hours. They came back the following week with Ruth's neighbor. Thad quietly produced 2 more primers from somewhere in the loft. He sat down with Addie, the evening before the second session, and they planned it out properly. What to teach first, what sequence made the most sense, how to handle someone who had some letters but not others, how to teach numbers alongside reading, so the practical applications were immediate. He had opinions on all of it, clear and specific, and so did she, and they argued productively about the order of things for an hour before landing on something they both thought would work. She ran the session the next day herself. Thad sat in the corner and read his book and did not intervene. Afterward, he said, "You're a good teacher." "I had a good one," she said. He looked at the table, slightly pleased, controlling it carefully. On a Saturday morning in late April, all four of them walked up to the high meadow. Addie carried Grace. The hawk sat in the crook of her arm, hooded still, with the coiled patience she had developed over months of recovery. She was a full-grown red-tail now, her plumage rich and complete, the chest pale against the dark wings, her talons wrapped around the leather perch on Addie's forearm, with easy, confident grip. The high meadow was half a mile above the cabin. The trail went steeply up through the timber, and then broke out suddenly onto an open south-facing slope where the snow had already melted off, and the first green was pushing through the dark soil. The view from up there was enormous, the whole of the Ironwood Valley spread below, the peaks going on in every direction, the sky overhead, the hard, bright blue of a good spring morning. They came out of the trees and stood in the sun. Nobody spoke for a minute. The mountain had that effect. Addie looked out at the valley and then up at the sky. The air was moving up here, a light, steady current running along the slope, the kind of air a hawk could use. She looked at Grace. Grace, hooded and still, tilted her head at a sound far above. Addie looked up. A thermal, the slight shimmer of rising warm air, invisible but real. She reached up and unhooded the hawk. Grace sat for 1 second, blinking in the full light, orienting. Then she found the thermal above, and everything about her sharpened. She spread her wings. The span of them was wider than Addie's arm could reach on either side, warm brown and tawny, edged in white. Addie unlatched the jess from her leg. Grace launched. She went straight up, no hesitation, tilting into the thermal and riding it in a long upward spiral, higher and higher, until she was a small dark shape against the blue, circling, climbing, free in the way that only things with wings can be free. She let out one cry from up there, sharp and carrying and wild, and then she banked and the thermal took her, and she went. Addie stood and watched until she couldn't see her anymore. She was aware of the three brothers standing around her, Gideon to her left, Thad behind her, Jasper somewhere slightly apart to her right, turned upward the same as she was. Nobody said anything for a while. They just watched the sky where the hawk had been. Then Gideon stepped closer and held something out to her. A stagecoach ticket, the one from February. He held it without ceremony, and beside it, folded neatly, the paper with her back wages tallied up. "Real freedom means having the right to leave," he said, the same words he had said in February, but quieter this time, without the formal weight of an offering. More like a reminder. "We protected you so you could belong to yourself, not to keep you for ourselves." She looked at the ticket in his hand. She took it. She stood there holding it for a moment, feeling the weight of it, which was almost nothing, paper and print, but represented something much heavier, a door, an out, a different version of her life that she could still walk into if she decided to. Gideon let her hold it. He didn't say anything more. She thought about Denver, about the institute and the cohort, and the women she would learn alongside, and the formal education she had every right to pursue. She thought about all of it clearly, with no panic in it, no desperation, either way. She thought about Ruth McIntosh's daughter learning to read her own name. She thought about Thad's voice saying, "Someday, you might be doing this for someone else." She thought about the primer on the shelf, with her name on the inside cover, property of Adelaide Thorne. She looked up. The sky where Grace had been was empty and brilliant and enormous. She smiled. She walked to the stagecoach that was waiting at the valley road below, 2 miles down, Because Gideon had arranged for it in February and maintained the arrangement all through the spring without saying anything about it. She walked down herself with the ticket in her hand and her back wages in her coat pocket and her chin level. She loaded her trunk. The driver secured it. She stepped up to the board. She stood there for a moment. Then she stepped back down. She walked it to the driver and handed the ticket back. He looked at it, looked at her, shrugged in the manner of a man who had seen stranger things, and untied her trunk and set it on the ground. She picked it up herself. She walked back up the road toward the mountain. The three brothers were waiting at the top of the valley road where the trail began. She didn't know if they had followed her down or if they had simply known. It didn't matter. She stopped in front of Gideon. "The right to leave is important," she said. "I have it. I used it." She held his gaze. "And I'm choosing to come back. Not because I have to. Because my heart is here and my work is here and this is my home." He looked at her for a long moment. "All right," he said. It was the same thing he had said in February when she refused the trapper's cabin plan. 2 words. No theater. Just Gideon Callahan acknowledging a fact that he believed and didn't need to decorate. Thad reached over and took her trunk from her hand without asking. Jasper had already turned toward the trail up the mountain. She fell into step with them. The mountain rose ahead of her, green and enormous and fully herself, and she walked toward it freely, carrying nothing heavier than her own choice. 2 years later, in the first week of April, Addie stood at the window of the schoolroom and watched 6 women and 3 girls walk up the trail through the spring mud. She knew all of them. Ruth McIntosh in front, with her characteristic efficiency of stride, the kind that said she had already decided where she was going, and everything between here and there was just distance to cover. Ruth's daughter, Emma, now 17, carrying a cloth bag with books in it, because Emma had moved past the primer 6 months ago and was currently working through territorial contract law with the focus of someone who intended to use it. The Pettit sisters from the West Valley, who had started together in the fall and progressed at different speeds and supported each other cheerfully through both. 3 women from the new mining settlement below the creek, names she had learned in February, and 2 girls, 10 and 11, whose mother had sent them up alone for the first time today, which was trust of a kind that still landed on Addie with its full weight. She turned from the window. The schoolroom was Thad's work. He had built it attached to the east side of the cabin over the course of the previous summer, pine-framed with a real plank floor, and 2 long tables with benches, a proper hearth of its own, and a board on the wall that Addie could write on with chalk. 2 shelves of books, most of them Thad's, some of them new. A map of the territory pinned to the wall beside the board. The county lines marked clearly with different chalk colors, so that when she taught jurisdiction and legal filing districts, people could see what they were talking about. She had opinions about teaching with maps. Thad had opinions about teaching without them. They had argued about it productively for 2 evenings and arrived at both. The women came through the door and settled themselves, and the session began. Addie taught the morning sessions herself, always. Literacy first, because everything else built on it, because a woman who could read her own name could read a contract, and a woman who could read a contract could refuse a bad one, and a woman who could refuse a bad one had options that she hadn't had the morning before. That was the whole point. Not abstract education, practical power, the specific usable kind. Compound interest, she said, when the literacy portion ended and the arithmetic began. She wrote it on the board. Who knows what this means? Silence. The particular silence of people who have heard a term but never had it explained. It's how debt grows, she said. She turned to the board and wrote out a number. Say a man borrows $20. The lender charges 10% interest. After 1 year, he owes $22. But the lender compounds the interest monthly, not yearly. She worked through the arithmetic, talking as she wrote. After 12 months at monthly compound, he doesn't owe $22. He owes $22.09. That doesn't sound like much. But after 5 years, she wrote the 5-year figure, Ruth McIntosh said. Lord. Yes, Addie said. That's how debt traps work. That's how a $20 loan becomes a $50 crisis. That's how men like my uncle kept people obligated to them for years past when the original debt was paid. She set down the chalk. When someone hands you a loan agreement, the interest structure is always in the third or fourth paragraph. Always. You find it before you sign. You calculate the true total yourself. You do not rely on the lender's summary. Emma McIntosh was already writing in her notebook. Addie watched her and felt something she had gotten better at naming over 2 years. Pride was part of it. But it was more than that. It was something closer to what Thad had described to her once, when she had asked him why he cared about teaching strangers. He had thought about it for a while and then said, the same way he said everything, precise and without excess, because knowledge passes forward. You teach someone, and they teach someone, and the thing you were taught outlives you by a generation. That's worth doing. She had written it down in her own notebook. After the session, she sat at the table in the main cabin with Thad, and they went over the week's lesson plan for the following 2 sessions, adjusting it based on where the students were. Thad kept notes on every student's progress in a ledger he had set up in September. Names and dates and specific gaps and specific strengths. He reviewed it with Addie after every session the way he reviewed accounts, systematically, looking for patterns. Emma is ready for the property rights chapter, he said. I know. I was thinking next week sooner. He looked at his ledger. She asked me 3 questions last Tuesday that were all about the same thing, just from different angles. She's circling it. Give her the chapter, and she'll stop circling. Addie looked at his ledger, at the column of names and dates and notes in his small, precise hand. You keep better records on these women than most courts keep on their own filings, she said. That's not a high bar, he said. But he was slightly pleased. Gideon came in from the upper pasture at midday with mud on his boots and a look that meant something needed fixing. He pulled off his coat and went to the basin and washed his hands and came to the table and told them the north fence line had taken damage in the spring thaw. A section of about 40 feet, where the post footings had heaved with the freeze-thaw cycle. He and Jasper had already assessed it. New posts, restrung wire, a day's work if the weather held. He said this to both of them, to Addie and Thad together, which was how he discussed the homestead as a shared enterprise, because that was what it was. Addie had filed a partial homestead claim on the east parcel the previous October, on the section that included the garden and the schoolroom and the trail to the high meadow. Thad had helped her draft the filing. The claim had been approved in January, which meant she owned ground on this mountain in her own name, registered with the county, documented and legal in hers. She had read the approval letter 3 times. Then she had folded it into the oilcloth pouch with the affidavit and put it on her shelf. After lunch, Gideon went back out to the fence line, and Thad went to the schoolroom to organize the bookshelves for the following week, and Addie sat alone at the table for a few minutes with her coffee. She thought about September, 2 years back, not with pain, just with clarity. The way you look at an old map and trace the route you took, noting where the road was hard and where it opened up. She had been bought on a loading dock for $50 in goods and a Winchester rifle. She had arrived on this mountain expecting the worst and found instead a 4th chair and an iron bar and a man who knelt down and kissed the edge of her scar in firelight without being asked to. She thought about what she had built since then, not what had been built for her, what she had built. The schoolroom, the lesson plans, the correspondence program she had started with the Denver Institute, which sent her materials, and to which she sent reports, and which had twice asked if she would consider coming to lecture in person. She was considering it. She had told them she would give them an answer by summer. Jasper appeared in the doorway from outside. He didn't come in. He leaned on the doorframe with his arms folded and looked at her with the quiet attention that still, after 2 years, was one of the most focused things she had ever experienced. The old pine on the south meadow edge is flowering, he said. Thought you'd want to see it. She got up and got her coat. They walked out together into the April afternoon. The sun was warm on the south face of the mountain. Proper spring warmth, the kind that felt like a promise rather than a threat. The high snow was still there on the peaks, but the lower slopes were green and loud, with meltwater. The pine he meant was a massive ponderosa, at the edge of the high meadow, the biggest tree on the property, old enough that Gideon had told her, once he thought it had been standing when his grandfather's generation first came west. It was flowering. Yes, the small male cones clustered at the branch tips, shedding yellow pollen in the light breeze. She stood under it and looked up through the branches at the sky. You sent a letter to Denver, Jasper said. He was not asking. He had seen her write it last week. Yes, she said. Told them I'd come in October. 2 weeks. She looked at him. Thad's going to run the literacy sessions while I'm gone. He's actually better at the beginner level than I am. Jasper looked at the tree. And after October. After October, I come home, she said. And we do this for another year. And then maybe I go back for another 2 weeks. Or maybe I don't. He nodded slowly. She had learned what his nods meant. This one meant he was satisfied, not because she was staying, but because she had a real answer, one that was actually hers. Gideon's going to say something about it, she said. He already knows, Jasper said. He's fine. A pause. He told me to tell you, he's proud. He won't say it himself. She smiled, I know. She looked out at the valley below. From up here, she could see the whole of it, the ribbon of the creek, the rooftops of the McIntosh homestead, 3 miles down, the trail that went to Blackwood, and the trail that went to the county seat, and the trail that went up to the high meadow, where Grace had launched herself into the thermal on that April morning a year ago. She had not seen Grace since. She thought about her, sometimes. She hoped she was still up there somewhere, riding thermals above the Ironwood Range, wild and complete, and entirely her own. She put her hands in her coat pockets and breathed the April air, pine, and meltwater, and the particular smell of this mountain in spring. Thad's voice came from somewhere below. He had come out of the schoolroom and was calling something up the slope to Gideon, whose answer came back from the direction of the fence line, short and carrying, the ordinary sound of the homestead working. People who knew each other's voices well enough to communicate across a distance of 200 yards. Jasper had already started back down the slope. She stood under the old pine, one more moment, looking at the valley. She had stood on a loading dock in Blackwood and looked above the heads of men who wanted to price her, and she had felt like nothing. She had told herself that day, looking at the nothing point above the crowd, that she would not cry, that she would not give those people the satisfaction, that she would simply wait and find out what came next. What had come next was this mountain. These people, this schoolroom with its chalkboard and its 2 long tables and the map on the wall with the county lines drawn in different colors. What had come next was her own name on a land claim, her own name in a primer on a shelf, her own voice in a clearing, reading a forged warrant apart, line by line in front of 40 armed witnesses. What had come next was the specific, ordinary, irreplaceable life she was living on this ridge. She turned and walked back down the slope toward the cabin, toward the smoke coming from both chimneys, toward the sound of Thad and Gideon, arguing mildly about the fence post problem, toward the 4th chair at the pine table, that smelled now like years of use and coffee and lamplight and belonging. She was not free because anyone gave it to her. She was free because she had learned, word by word, and clause by clause, and lesson by lesson, how to be. Because 3 men had built her a room with a door that locked from the inside and told her the rest was hers to figure out. She had figured it out. She went inside. There's a moment in this story that says everything you need to know about what real freedom looks like. It's not the moment Gideon Callahan raises $50 and a rifle on that auction block. It's not even the moment Addie stands in a snowy clearing and takes apart a forged warrant line by line in front of 40 witnesses. The real moment comes later, quieter, when Gideon hands her a stagecoach ticket back to civilization, back to the life she could have had, and tells her plainly, real freedom means having the right to leave. That's the heart of this whole story. Addie wasn't rescued so she could belong to someone else. She was given a door that locked only from the inside, and for the first time in her life, the choice was hers. Whether to stay behind that door, whether to open it, whether to walk down that mountain and never look back. And when she does walk down that road with her ticket in hand, and then turns around and walks right back up, that's not a woman who needed saving. That's a woman who already saved herself and simply chose where she wanted to stand. This story asks us to think about what we actually give the people we love. Do we give them cages dressed up as comfort? Or do we give them the tools literacy, knowledge, the ability to read the fine print of their own lives so they can choose their own path, even if that path sometimes leads away from us? Thad's words echo through the whole story. Ignorance is the easiest cage a bad man can lock you in. Knowledge isn't just power in the abstract. It's the difference between being sold and being free. It's the difference between signing a bad contract out of desperation and knowing exactly which clause is the trap. And there's something else here too, a story about scars. Not just the visible one on Addie's back, but the invisible ones so many of us carry, the parts of ourselves we're sure will make people look away in disgust or pity. What this story offers is a different possibility, that our wounds aren't proof of our damage. They're proof that we survived something and kept going. We found this, Jasper says, looking at what Addie thought was the ugliest part of her, and he doesn't mean he found her brokenness. He means he found her. By the end, Addie isn't just free. She's building something, a schoolroom, a legacy, a way of passing forward exactly what was given to her. And that, maybe, is the real ending of any story about rescue. It isn't finished when you're saved. It's finished when you turn around and start lifting someone else up the same way. Thank you for riding along on this journey through the Ironwood Range with Addie Gideon, Jasper, and Thad. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs a reminder that it's never too late to choose your own life. This story, The Blood Bargain, is a work of historical fiction. All characters, names, events, and dialogue are entirely fictional, and any resemblance to real persons, living or dead, or actual events is purely coincidental. This content contains mature themes, including depictions of historical practices of coercion and violence for narrative and dramatic purposes only, and does not endorse, condone, or minimize such practices in any historical or contemporary context. Viewer discretion is advised.